Warning, this story contains scenes that may offend people. If you are easily offended and very sensitive, please turn back now. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy the story. Thank you for listening. Shattered by Brony Numo, Chapter 1. For many years, Rainbow Dash had fantasised about this moment. Its attainment had, after all, been her lifelong goal, and the one thing she had worked the hardest for to accomplish, for as long as she could remember. She dreamt about it in many a night. Her dreams had always been much the same. She had stood surrounded by a crowd of other eager Pegasi in the Coliseum. As one excited mass, they had waited patiently, staring upwards at an empty stage. In her dreams, she had held her breath in nervous anticipation, listening to the faint buzz of whispered conversation around her, until, wait, there she is! There she is! The appearance of Spitfire, captain of the Wonderbolt and subject of every conversation around her, would invariably bring the mass of Pegasi to a sudden hush, and pure deathly silence reigned over the entire assemblage. To Rainbow Dash, this part of each dream seemed to play in slow motion, each movement unfolding itself in an impossibly long stretch of time. But that was always part of the magic. Slowly, Spitfire approached her place at the front of the stage, her head rising slowly so that her mouth reached the microphone. She would always make a long pause, taking the time to swing her gaze out over the mass of assembled Pegasi, her eyes sparkling as she did so. The unfaltering gaze of hundreds of pairs of eyes followed her every move, the stadium reaching a point where it must have been possible to hear a pin drop, even on the relatively soundless cloud surface. Then, invariably, with a twinkle in her eye and a flourish of her hoof, Spitfire would produce the prize, a brand new immaculate Wonderbolt flight suit with goggles placed carefully atop the perfectly folded blue and gold fabric, and she would hold it above her head, tantalizingly balanced on a single hoof, while she gazed out across the crowd. Not a pony moved, not a feather ruffled, and when Spitfire spoke, her voice always seemed to shatter the very air itself, and every pony hung on her every word. Fillies and gentle colts, I want to thank you all for coming today. You've all put on fantastic performances for me and the team today, and I'd like to say you're all winners, and that you've all done well enough. You've all exceeded my expectations, but unfortunately, there can only be one new Wonderbolt. She would pause here, leaving her audience to sit on pins and needles, and she grinned before she spoke again, her word magnified by the magic-powered microphone standing before her. So, without further ado, the winner of this competition and the newest member of the Wonderbolts is... Sometimes Rainbow Dash would snap awake right at this moment, blinking in confusion. No! Who won? I have to know, she would yell, punching her pillow for emphasis. Sometimes Spitfire would utter a name Rainbow Dash did not recognise, and some pony she didn't recognise would cry out in joy, flying up to the stage to receive their new uniform, while Dash looked on in barely suppressed shock. On those nights, she would wake up in a cold sweat. More often than not, however, it would be her name that graced Spitfire's lips. It would be her name that was broadcasted out to the ears of every pony assembled. It would be her to scream in joy. It would be her to do a somersault in the air as she rushed up onto the stage. It would be her to accept that uniform. So many times had Dash dreamt of the moment that it seemed almost surreal to be experiencing it outside of her own fantasies. It had been a normal morning, and she woke up late as she normally did, stretching herself and rubbing the sleep from her eyes when she finally decided it was time to drag herself out of bed. She was still blinking groggily as she made her way to the kitchen for breakfast, which happened to be the cold leftovers of her dinner from the night previous. Rainbow Dash had never been much for cooking. The slow, melodic whirring sound of the coffee machine filled the kitchen. Rainbow Dash stood at the kitchen counter, tapping her hoof impatiently as the sustenance-giving liquid dripping slowly into her favourite mug, which of course sported the Wonderbolt's signature lightning bolt logo. She grabbed the cup and took a long gulp. As soon as it was full, her eyelids flying open as the electrifying drink hit her taste buds, and she smacked her lips together, still rather put off by the bitter taste despite having taken her coffee black for years. The hungry Pegasus scarfed down the remains of her vegetable stir-fry from the night before in a matter of seconds, washing it down with another swig of coffee, and she grimaced. The combination of flavours was not something she wished to try again. Finished, she grabbed her mug in her mouth, careful not to spill any coffee as she trotted from the kitchen. It was time for her morning flight, a ritual Rainbow Dash had always enjoyed. The peace and quiet of a good, exhilarating flight not only gave her the chance to stretch her wings, but also to prepare for the day ahead. The eager mare stretched out her wings, loosening them up and preparing them for her first flight of the day. Mere inches from the door, she happened to look downwards and froze in her tracks. Her mug, forgotten, fell to the floor as her jaw dropped, and the remainder of her coffee splashed unnoticed onto the cloud floor, and she stared down at the floor, and the envelope seemed to stare back at her. It was a crisp parchment in an off-white colour. It was not, however, the envelope itself that had grabbed her attention. She received plenty of mail in similar envelopes, mostly bills and junk mail. No, the importance of this piece of mail lay not in its plain envelope, but the emblem used to seal it, a perfect, instantly recognisable lightning bolt. And Rainbow Dash stood and stared for several moments. This was it! The day she had anticipated for years had finally arrived, and on the floor in front of her lay a letter which could have only come from the Wonderbolts. There was no other explanation. She had arrived. As soon as she came to her senses, the excited mess scooped the letter up and flew it back to the kitchen, sweeping dishes and carry-out containers off the top of her table, and gingerly laid the envelope down. Unable to hold herself back, Rainbow Dash tore into the envelope, carefully preserving its emblem as she removed its contents, and she bit her lip in anticipation as she held the creased letter in her hooves. Slowly she unfolded it, her eyes flitting across its face as she read the words, still half in disbelief. Dear Miss Rainbow Dash, as you have undoubtedly assumed upon receiving this letter, you are cordially invited to attend a practice session with the Wonderbolts in 2 days' time. As I'm sure you are also aware of, a long-standing member of the Wonderbolts, Rapid Fire, is to retire at the end of this season, and we are looking for a suitable Pegasus to replace him on our team. I would like to be the first to offer congratulations to you, as we would like to offer you the opportunity to try out for that position. You have proven yourself worthy many times over, particularly with your spectacular performance at the Young Flyers competition. I do hope you will accept this offer, as I believe you would make a fantastic addition to our team. Practice will be at our Cloudsdale training facility, beginning at 9 AM sharp in 2 days. We hope to see you there. Best regards, Wonderbolt Team Captain, Spitfire. Rainbow Dash stood in dumbfounded silence, reading the letter over and over again, just to be sure it was real. She blinked several times, hardly able to breathe as she stared at the writing. Her dreams were about to come true. In 2 days' time, Rainbow Dash found herself standing on a small cloud high above the vast expanses of cloud and open sky that was the Wonderbolts training grounds, and she swallowed a nervous lump as she looked down. Far below her, 4 members of the Wonderbolts, Spitfire and Soren included, stood on a cloud staring back up at her. As Spitfire had explained to her upon her arrival, her tryout was actually set to take place before the practice officially started. She had then given Rainbow Dash a few minutes to warm up, but the Rainbow Mane Pegasus found herself unable to focus. She was too nervous. Not that a few minutes of warm-up would have made any difference for her. She had already spent her entire life training for this moment. The nervous Pegasus had also managed to cram as much practice as possible into the last 2 days. She was as ready as she would ever be, but yet she couldn't shake the agitation that stuck in her mind. The actual tryout already differed from what she had expected and dreamt it to be like in one major respect. She was the only one there. Rainbow Dash had always assumed that the Wonderbolts chose new members from some sort of competition. In truth, she hadn't really known what they did until she was invited herself. As the new member selection process was always kept well hidden by the team, she had been surprised, therefore, upon showing up at the Wonderbolts training facility to find that no one else would be attending. In a way, it put even more pressure on her than an actual competition might have. She had no one to compare her performance to but herself. It all came down to this. Every move she had invented, tried, practiced and perfected from the day she first learnt to fly had been designed to impress the Wonderbolts. And now, here she was, about to try and impress the Wonderbolts. Rainbow Dash's stomach felt like it had flipped upside down. Below, she watched apprehensively as Spitfire brought a small metallic whistle to her mouth. A few seconds later, she blew, and the shrill call echoing up to Rainbow Dash. It was now or never. Throwing her wings out to their full length, Rainbow Dash took a running start and thrust herself towards the edge of the cloud. She kicked her hind legs into the springy surface and flapped her wings twice for lift, and soared out over the edge. Her athletic frame silhouetted against Celestia's sun high above. She remained poised in the air, almost frozen in space. For a moment before she plummeted downward, the speeding Pegasus stretched herself out and poised her hooves in front of her head, picking up speed as her aerodynamic form cut through the air like an arrow. A streak of rainbow shot out behind her as she flew faster, and near the bottom of her path, she spread her wings to their full extent in one smooth motion and threw herself into a nearly bone-crushing vertical turn, flattening her height path out so that she shot right over the heads of her judges. Her head pounded from the stress of the gravity-defying turn, but she ignored it and angled herself upwards, prepared for the next part of her routine. Her wings flared as she brought herself upwards into a near-perfect circle, keeping her high speed up as she executed 1, 2, 3 perfect loop-de-loops. She exited the top of her third loop, flying even faster than before, and used her momentum to fly straight through a series of small white clouds which had been set up in a perfect line just for this purpose. The rainbow trail steaming out behind her made the clouds appear as but small white beads strung out on a 6-coloured string. She angled her way into another wide sweeping turn, arcing downwards as well as around, and the assembled Wonderbolts looked on as Rainbow Dash flew straight at them. They twitched their wings nervously as she barreled towards them, ready to dive out of the way. At the last possible moment, she pulled off another high-speed, small-radius turn and shot straight upwards, punching through another cloud just above their heads. 2 of the Wonderbolt's jaws fell slack as the rainbow streak blazed past them, Spitfire cracking a wide smile while Soaring leaned backwards, straining to see Rainbow Dash as she propelled herself even further straight up. High above, Rainbow Dash levelled off before she lost too much speed and entered another wide horizontal circular turn, looping in underneath herself to continue her spiral. As she let the loops grow tighter and tighter, the rainbow trail left behind her in the sky adopted the shape of a swirling vortex as she spiraled ever downward. The wind around her began to whip, coaxed into a circular spiral motion by her flight. She had to strain to keep tightening her circles as she flew, gaining speed all the while. Her head began to feel dizzy, but she brushed the sensation away, concentrating on perfecting her ever-tightening vortex. Just when she thought she couldn't possibly tighten her turn anymore, she broke into a straight dive, plummeting downwards. Before spreading her wings again to throw her body into a tight U-turn, her wing joints screamed in protest and her head pounded, but the strained Pegasus followed through, retaining much of her speed as she flapped hard. Powering herself straight upward once again, she entered the bottom of the vortex she had created earlier, pushing herself forward with reckless abandon. Then force of her upward motion interrupted by the swirling motion of the vortex, and it exploded apart just as she exited the top. The rainbow contrails dissipated into the cloud of multi-hued mist as they spread apart. As the remaining mist of her last stunt sparkled in the sun, still fading away, Rainbow Dash was already focusing on her final and most important trick. The aptly named Rainbow Vortex had gone off without a hitch, but she knew in the back of her mind that her finale had to be absolutely perfect. Her wings continued to flap like mad, propelling her ever higher, and she gradually lost speed as she soared upwards, and finally coming to a near standstill. At this point, she simply let herself fall. Rainbow Dash entered a controlled tumble, gaining momentum as she lost every bit of height she had pushed herself up to. She pointed her nose downwards, gradually straightening herself out as she gained speed. The world began to flash past her faster than her eyes could keep track of, as the dividing Pegasus plummeted ever faster. Rainbow Dash felt a cone of air begin to form around her. This was it. As the air cone began to take definite shape around her, everything started to go wrong. She had only performed the Sonic Rainbow 3 times, but she had attempted on more than enough occasions to know when something was amiss, and she felt the air resistance ahead of her press even more against her, and she flapped even faster to counteract. However, Instead of forcing the cone into a tighter shape, like Rainbow Dash knew she had to do to break through it, she felt herself losing speed. In a matter of seconds, she knew the cone was going to collapse completely and fling her backwards. She could not let that happen, not in front of the Wonderbolts. In a split-second decision, she pitched one wing outwards but held the other back. The sudden imbalance threatened to throw her completely off course. But she held herself steady, rolling over several times in mid-air to counteract the bone-rattling force of the sudden move. Seconds later, she felt the force of air resistance dissipate as the sonic cone fell away around her. She flapped her wings once, using them like a sail to exit the barrel roll and smooth out her flight path. The manoeuvre had worked as intended. At least she had broken free of the sonic cone. Now, however, she was on her own. Her routine had gone flawlessly up to this point, but without a sonic rainbow, she now had to improvise a finale. If the force of the wind had allowed her control over her mouth, she would have grinned as her mind immediately flashed to a memory of the time Trixie had come to Ponyville. Instantly, Rainbow Dash knew what to do. Realigning herself, she flashed through the remnants of the clouds she had broken up earlier, making sure as much mist as possible was dragged into her wake and pulled along behind her as possible. She once again angled towards the Wonderbolts, speeding in their direction, and at the last moment she threw her wings out like an air brake and slowed to a stop almost completely. Settling just on the edge of the cloud in front of her heroes, the water, having retained its momentum, kept going just past her, only to dissipate, catching the light of the sun and forming a magnificent, if brief, rainbow between her and the Wonderbolts. Rainbow Dash panted hard, staring expectantly at Spitfire. The other mare brought a hoof to her chin and rubbed it, as if in deep thought. She turned to Soarin and whispered something in his ear. The Pegasus stallion nodded in silent agreement. Spitfire turned back towards Rainbow Dash. A slight frown adorned her face, and Rainbow Dash's heart, which was already beating at a mile per minute, sank when she saw her face. Spitfire looked her over, and Rainbow Dash met her gaze. Her golden eyes seemed to stare deep into her, and she gulped when Spitfire began to speak. So, Rainbow Dash, were you going to perform a sonic rainbow for us today? Rainbow Dash found that she could hardly speak. Her mouth felt strangely dry, and she opened and closed it several times as she tried to find words. And Spitfire just blinked at her. Rainbow Dash swallowed and finally managed to say something. I was going to, but I didn't set it up right. I had to bail out. Spitfire nodded, tapping her hoof against her chin. I see. Well, in that case, Rainbow Dash, I'm afraid I have no choice. Rainbow Dash just stared at her, unblinking, unmoving. Inside, however, was a completely different story. She was going into crisis control, entering a vain internal struggle to try and figure out what she did wrong. How could she have failed? She knew the sonic rainbow was special, but had they been expecting it? No, they couldn't have been expecting her to do it. That didn't make any sense at all. But to welcome you to join the Wonderbolts as a full member. Congratulations! Huh? I said congratulations, Spitfire laughed. Your performance was magnificent, even if it didn't include a sonic rainbow. And the fact that you could bail out of a failed trick and recover your finale so easily shows that you're both good at thinking on your wings and acting quickly and instinctively in difficult situations. You'd make a brilliant Wonderbolt. Welcome aboard. Rainbow Dash stood speechless, her lips quivering, and Spitfire's grin faltered. Hey, Dash? You okay? Still, the Rainbow Mare did not move. Spitfire raised an eyebrow in confusion. She fled a presence to her side and turned to see Soarin standing beside her. I think you broke her, Spitz. Oh my gosh! Both Wonderbolts stumbled backwards as the Rainbow Mane Mare before them rocketed into the sky, screaming her elation to the heavens as she soared end over end in a tight circle, almost as if she were doing backflips in mid-air. Spitfire could not help but smile as she watched the ecstatic mare flip head over hooves. She glanced over to Soarin to see a wide grin spread across his face, his eyes following the sea and mare's every movement. And Spitfire looked back towards Rainbow Dash, who had finally stopped her aerial display, only to do a quick double take as she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. and she glanced back at Soren. She could not be sure, but for a brief instant she thought she saw his tongue flick out of his mouth. So, Dash, have you had much experience with flying ropes? Spitfire leaned against one of the benches in the locker room, stifling a laugh as she watched Rainbow Dash admire her new Wonderbolts flight suit in the mirror. Well, besides flying with the weather team, not much. Rainbow Dash found she could still hardly tear herself away from the image of herself in a Wonderbolts flight suit. Dear Celestia, she felt like she was dreaming. After striking another pose and taking a good long look at herself, she spun around to face her idol. There was that one time after the Young Flyers competition when I got to spend the day with the you guys. That was about the only synchronized flying I've ever done. Spitfire nodded as Rainbow Dash trotted over. Not bad, not bad. Well, looks like you'll need some more practice in that department. And speaking of practice, the other guys are probably waiting for us outside. Let's fly. Right behind you! Rainbow Dash smiled brightly as she followed the elder mare out from the locker room and back out into the open. The other Wonderbolts had all gathered there, and Rainbow Dash beamed as they welcomed her into their midst. She could not have been happier. The ponies she had idolised for as long as she could remember now accepted her as an equal, and she received slaps on the back, hoof bumps and other congratulations from all, and she just couldn't stop smiling throughout. When practice finally ended, Rainbow Dash felt more exhausted than she could ever remember being before. Her wings burned and every joint in her body seemed on fire. Drops of sweat ran down her face and streaked her entire body. Thankfully, the fabric of the suit helped wick some of the moisture away from the skin so its wearer did not overheat. Rainbow Dash wiped her hoof across her brow, scattering droplets through the air as she did so. She was breathing heavily, but smiling all the same. The practice had been a trial by fire for the new recruit, and Spitfire and her teammates had put Rainbow Dash through her paces, testing her to find her limits. Smiling now as she approached the sweaty, bright-eyed seeing mare, Spitfire could not help but be impressed. Great work out there today, Dash. You were showing some real improvement towards the end. I think we will have those kinks with synchronized flying ironed out completely in a few more weeks. Rainbow Dash beamed. Thanks, Spitfire. That really means a lot to me. Don't mention it, Philly. Spitfire grinned, giving Rainbow Dash a good-natured slap on her rear, as teammates are apt to, as she brushed past. She did not see Rainbow Dash blush heavily as the highly excitable filly ducked, trying to hide the uncanny amount of red that had suddenly flushed her face to a shade that nearly matched the red streak in her mane. Rainbow Dash hung behind the other Wonderbolts, trying her best to cool herself down. When she looked up again, Spitfire and the others were walking back towards the locker rooms, chatting happily amongst themselves. Rainbow Dash hurried to catch up with them, and she flew the short distance and landed amongst them, Spitfire chuckling as she did. So, Dash, you up for a celebration with us tonight? A celebration? With you guys tonight? Really? Soren and several of the others laughed. Spitfire merely grinned. Of course. We always celebrate when we get new members. We're heading to a bar in downtown Cloudesdale. You game? You know it. Rainbow Dash felt like leaping into the air again, but managed to keep herself under control. I mean, that sounds cool. Alright, we're going to shower down quick and then we'll head over there. Actually, Rainbow Dash pawed at the cloud beneath her hoof nervously, a coy smile on her face. I kind of want to fly down to Ponyville to tell my friends the good news first. Spitfire gave her a knowing grin. Okay, just meet us at Cloud 9 Inn Bar in about an hour? You bet! Rainbow Dash smiled before jumping into the air and flying off, angling towards Ponyville. Applejack sighed in contentment as she walked through the orchard. Autumn was coming, and that meant applebuck season was near. Applejack smiled at each tree, and she knew each of them personally, every branch, leaf, and knot in their bark. Each tree was laden with nearly ripe apples. Ever careful not to put all of her apples in one basket, she still could not help but wonder about the crop they would have this year. She could only hope it would be a good one, but looking around her, she felt that it would be. She felt the wind on her face as she climbed a hill, reaching the crest to look out over her entire orchard. It appeared as a nearly endless sea of green leaves and green unripe apples, and she grinned. These were her babies. So lost was she in their splendour that she almost missed the voice calling out to her from above. She did hear something, however, and quickly glanced upwards. Applejack! Applejack looked up just in time to see a cyan and rainbow blur speed down towards her. She grinned as she recognised her best friend. Well, what do you know? Look who has a fancy new outfit now. Like you needed your head any further up in the clouds. Come on, AJ, I'm a Wonderbolt now. Rainbow Dash's voice cracked as she did her flip in the air, coming to land just in front of her friend. A wide grin plastered on her face. I did it! I finally did it! Congratulations, Rainbow. I'm happy for you. Applejack smiled and cuffed the Pegasus on the shoulder. Just don't forget us down here on the ground now, you hear? Rainbow Dash flushed a slight pink at that comment. Come on, you know I wouldn't do that. Suddenly she leapt into the air, doing a flip before hovering in place. See, Applejack, I've got to tell the others, and then I'm meeting the Wonderbolts in Cloudsdale to celebrate. Applejack could not help but snicker at the overly excited mare, listening as her voice cracked once again. All right, Sugar Cube, you go have your fun. I'm proud of you. Thanks, AJ. Rainbow Dash smiled before rocketing off towards town. As she receded into the distance, Applejack could have sworn she heard the faint cry of Wonderbolts. She chuckled to herself, turning back towards her home. That silly filly. The cloud house was dark. The sun had not yet risen, and the darkness of the wee hours of the morning reigned somewhere in the peaceful still of the early morning, and now hooted, his call falling across a silent landscape. Inside the large floating house, the 5 assembled ponies had long before grown accustomed to the lack of light. Having been waiting in near pitch black since the night fell, their eyes had barely gotten used to the low light conditions, and everything around them seemed a blur of grey. The moon was well on its way towards the horizon, and sunrise was but a few hours forgone. Fluttershy, Pinkie Pie, Twilight Sparkle, Applejack and Rarity, the latter ones, making use of Twilight's cloud walking spell, had nonetheless been awake for hours, waiting well into the night for their friend to return home. Despite the early hour, however, no pony was really tired. All were too excited to think about sleep, as soon as Rainbow Dash had given them the good news. They had been caught up in the whirlwind of manic activity that was Pinkie Pie when she prepared a last-minute party. Streamers of every colour to match the new Wonderbolt's mane had been strung throughout the house. Confetti to match the streamers was set to explode. An assortment of food had been brought up. A large banner just barely visible to the 5 friends in the low light had been strung across the kitchen entryway and offered its message of congratulations in tall, colourful letters. The Pinkie Pie, officially dubbed Congratulations on Making the Wonderbolts and Making All Your Dreams Come True party, was all set, except for the fact that it was missing the guest of honour. In truth, no pony knew when Rainbow Dash would show up. They knew she had been celebrating with the Wonderbolts that night, but they did not know when their celebration was set to end. As a result, all 5 were stuck waiting, well past midnight for her return. They busied themselves by chatting excitedly, as difficult as that was when all were crouched behind pieces of furniture waiting for their cue. Oh, when do you think she'll be here? I'm all for being fashionably late, but waiting this long is ridiculous. Rarity peeked up over the edge of the couch. She had crouched behind, watching the front door in barely hid agitation. Relax, Rare. She's had a night out with her heroes. The least we can do for her is wait a little longer, Applejack chuckled. I just hope she ain't too plum tuckered out for a little after party. Shh! Everybody! Shh! I think I can hear her. Pinkie, you've been saying that every minute for the past half hour. She isn't here yet. Twilight Sparkle, having grown annoyed by the pink pony's near constant false alarms, hissed at her friend in a barely constrained whisper. Shouldn't your pinky sense tell you when she's near or something? Silly Twilight, I don't control what my pinky sense tells me, or when it does. The bubbly pony giggled to herself. Twilight had to resist the urge to slap her hoof to her face. But that doesn't make any... Oh, forget it. My pinky sense has been acting really strange because it kept telling me that something terrible was going to happen. And then I thought something terrible did happen when the oven at Sugar Cube Corner caught fire. But we put that out easily, so it wasn't really that terrible. So I thought something else terrible might have happened, but then nothing terrible did happen. And then they actually got into the Wonderbolts, and I said, wait, this isn't terrible at all. This is super duper amazing. So I was still waiting for something terrible to happen, and I wondered when was that going to happen and what it would be. But then all of a sudden, my pinky sense stopped telling me anything just a little while ago, and nothing terrible happened. So I think it was a mistake. Pinkie Pie grinned hugely, her wide, toothy smile visible even in the dark. This time Twilight Sparkle really did have to slap a hoof to her face, dragging it downwards for good measures, before she sighed in expiration. She shot a quick glare at Pinkie Pie before returning her attention to the door. "Shh! Every pony! Shh! I think I hear her!" Twilight very nearly yelled across the room, almost forgetting to keep her voice low. "For the last time, Pinkie, she's not—" "Actually, Twilight, I think I hear something outside too." Fluttershy spoke up. "Quiet, y'all! This might be her this time." Applejack put a hoof to her mouth, motioning the others to silence. Each cocked their ears, listening intently. Outside, the faint but unmistakable rustling sound of flapping wings could just barely be heard. It grew more and more audible as the five friends eagerly listened. So excited and so intently focused were they that they could not hear the even fainter sound of quiet, muffled sobbing. Instead, they carried on blissfully unaware, prepared for what each assumed would be a night of fun, games and celebration. They could not have been more wrong. When the door opened, the room exploded in a sudden jumble of light colours, confetti and ponies as each jumped from their hiding places, laughing and shouting, their voices full of mirth. "Surprise!" Rainbow Dash stared about the room in horror. The others, some with their eyes closed, were shouting congratulations, eager for the party to begin. One by one, however, they fell silent as their eyes opened and they took in the scene before them. Rainbow Dash stood in the doorway, yet she was not the eager, excitable, devil-may-care Rainbow Dash that they had expected to see. She did not look to be riding the wave of pure, blissful pleasure high that would have come from finally achieving her dreams. On the contrary, she did not look like the Rainbow Dash they remembered at all. She seemed glued in place, in the threshold. She was immobile, save for her eyes. Her eyes were bloodshot and appeared as if they had receded back, as if they were cowering backwards when confronted with their own friends. They flicked about the room seemingly in fear, as they flashed from one face to the next. Her mane was a mess, various hairs of every colour splayed out all over, as if shaken out of place. Her ears were folded back, as if out of fear. A small bruise adorned on her cheek. Her tail hung limp behind her, just as messy as her mane. Her feathers were ruffled, her wings clenched at her sides, as if in a protective embrace of herself. Very subtly, almost imperceptibly so, she shook in her hoofs as she stood, as if a chill had swept the room when none had. For a moment that seemed to last for hours. No one said anything. The five gathered ponies stared at Rainbow Dash, their party now long forgotten. No pony knew or even could know what to possibly say. Then suddenly Rainbow Dash jumped into the air and shot past them, flying towards the stairs, her room and shelter. Every pony else was too stunned to follow. Every pony else except Applejack. She took off at a good clip, her speed not lost on the unfamiliar cloud surface, chasing after her best friend. "Sugar Cube, wait! What happened? We can help ya! We can help! Come back, Rainbow!" She charged up the stairs in hot pursuit of the distraught Pegasus. Rainbow Dash rounded a corner at the top with Applejack right behind, belining straight for her room. She flew into the doorway and Applejack skidded to a halt just outside. The orange mare's eyes went wide at the sight of her friend. She got a good look before the Pegasus turned around to face her. Rainbow Dash looked distraught. Her bloodshot eyes, now filling with tears, seemed to plead with Applejack. Rainbow Dash said nothing. Applejack gulped. She understood. Rainbow Dash slammed the door shut. Applejack understood. She had seen. Just before her best friend had spun around, she had seen. She did not want to, could not believe, yet she had seen. It took her to her core, and she tried desperately to think of something, anything that could explain what she had seen. Anything except that. But there was no answers. There was only that which she could hardly fathom, yet understood all the same. She saw the dark stain of blood running down her best friend's rear leg, and she knew like a great 2-ton boulder fall into the pit of her stomach, exactly what it meant.